Wonderful. Okay, good evening, and I am very pleased to welcome Dr. James Brown to speak to us this evening. James is a research associate and project manager of the Intoxicating Spaces project based at the University of Sheffield. He's a historian of early modern England, and he's got broad-ranging interests in intoxication and drinking culture. James has previously worked on other large projects, including the earlier iteration of the Intoxicants project, and also Inner Lives, which looked at kind of witchcraft and emotions in the early modern world. James's Warwick PhD looked at inns, taverns, and alehouses in early modern Southampton. And the first time I met James was several years ago. I can't remember, it was probably 2015, 2016, at the food studies at Summer University at Tours, where James was a guest lecturer. And he was, I very vividly remember him taking us on a kind of virtual drinking tour around the port town of southern England. And I think that's partly speaks to James's interest in kind of concepts and theories of space and how those interact with kind of drinking culture. And I think that's certainly something that's going to kind of come up this evening. The topic of James's talk is about tea gardens and new intoxicants in early modern London. And without further ado, I'll hand over to James.
Thank you so much, Charlie, for the generous introduction, and indeed to you and the rest of the organisers for inviting me along to the seminar. It's really great to be here, albeit virtually, as a huge fan of the series. Firstly, a little bit, actually, I better share my screen first. Hang on, getting ahead of myself. On share. Slide, play from start. Can you all see that, Charlie? Is that coming in nice and large? Brilliant, good. Yeah, first of all, a little bit of context, as Charlie mentioned in the introduction there. The paper emerges from the HERA-funded research project Intoxicating Spaces. We're exploring the impact of what we term new intoxicants, chocolate, coffee, opium, sugar, tea and tobacco on 4 European cities, Amsterdam, Hamburg, London and Stockholm, with special reference to the spatial environments through which they were exchanged and consumed, and which they in turn helped to shape. And this fairly brief paper would like to argue that the ubiquitous al fresco space of the tea garden was in the vanguard of and remained central to these new consumer habits in early modern London. And the topic, as the little sort of tweet promoting this session accurately gauged, was naturally inspired by the COVID-19 pandemic and its resulting lockdowns, which have seen an efflorescence of creative outdoor consumption spaces in response to bans and restrictions on indoor socializing in bars, cafes and restaurants. And I actually live in the very heart of Sheffield's pleasure or party district. And here's an example just round the corner from me, Division Street, which I photographed earlier in the year. This used to be a normal road, but this has been pedestrianised and made over for al fresco eating and drinking. And the research for this article is still at the paper and the article that will emerge from it is still at a comparatively early stage, but I'm very grateful for this opportunity to organise my thoughts and to gain any feedback that you might have. Now, there were, of course, various kinds of al fresco drinking space in early modern London, from the street cellars recently investigated by Charlie Taverner and Freya Purcell, to the temporary or pop-up booths that sprang up in royal parks or during fairs. I especially like these short-term tented coffee houses which opened on the frozen Thames during the Frost Fair of 1740, pleasingly named the Frost Fair Coffee House, which is just there on the left, and the Friesland Coffee House on the right, while here's a makeshift canvas version of Lloyd's Coffee House in Hyde Park, depicted on a 1780 watercolour. And here it is just here. You can just about make out the words on the awning there. However, by far the most common manifestation of the outdoor consumption of intoxicants was the pleasure or tea garden, a species of space that flourished in the metropolis, as in other cities across the continent, between the 17th and early 19th centuries. Now, the significance of these environments, especially for the enjoyment and assimilation of new intoxicating substances, has yet to receive the historiographical attention it perhaps deserves. Outside of a handful of studies of specific gardens, especially the major ones such as Vauxhall, the last historical survey of them is actually from 1896, which is William Roth's pioneering the London Pleasure Gardens. And most historians of intoxicants and intoxication, which has been a real sort of historiographical boom lately, pretty much ignore them in favour of the architecturally bounded indoor spaces of alehouse, coffeehouse, tavern and inn. They only get a single passing reference, for example, in Markman Ellis's brilliant recent monograph, Empire of Tea. And the sort of the notion of their insignificance was occasionally even reinforced by contemporaries. In 1846, for example, the German traveller Carl Gustav Karras incorrectly noted that places of outdoor refreshment, coffee gardens and the like, without which a German can scarcely form the idea of a promenade, do not exist here in London. And the Russian tourist Nikolai Mikhailovich Karamzin was much more accurate in 1789 when he observed that what gangettes are to the French, tea gardens are here, i.e. in London. So to understand the character and distribution of tea gardens in the metropolis, we must first get a sense of the capital's historical geography, with which I'm sure most of you are familiar. Here it is on a 1720 map. So as we can see, although increasing exponentially in size throughout the period, a process that would eventually see the envelopment and effective demise of the tea garden in the late 1800s, the 18th century capital was far from the sprawling metropolis or loose baggy monster it is today. Despite being one of the world's most populous cities, its built environment was effectively bounded by Oxford Street and Holborn to the north, by the river to the south, with only a handful of developments in Lambeth and Southwark, by the outer boundary of the old city walls to the east, and by St James's to the west. Beyond this was a semi-rural, undulating landscape of open countryside, heaths, pastures, woods, meadows, rivers, streams, and villages. And this was the domain of the urban tea garden. So pleasure or tea gardens can be first detected in London in the middle decades of the 17th century, when visits to Mulberry Gardens in St James's, Spring Garden in Charing Cross, and Jamaica Garden in Southwark are recorded by John Evelyn and Samuel Pepys. The latter, in typical fashion, called them very silly places. However, their heyday or golden age was the 18th century and into the early decades of the 1800s. Historiographical estimates of their numbers vary from around 200 at the top end to the more conservative figure of 65 proposed by Penelope Caulfield. I've identified around 90, the locations of 81 of which I've been able to pinpoint with some accuracy. So here's what I think is the first definitive geo-located map of London tea gardens in the long 18th century. And as you can hopefully make out, there was a very broad geographical spread across the capital's rural hinterland, although using the terms of human geography, 5 broad clusters can be identified. There was a particularly concentrated central group around Clerkenwell, a Marylebone group, a Chelsea group, a south of the river group, and 2 outlying Islington and Hampstead groups. Distributed along the leafy roads and arteries leading out of the city to the north. And this map is actually live on the project's Tableau, the software I made it with, and I've just put the link. Well, I was about to say I'm going to put the link in the chat if you want to explore it at your leisure, perhaps over a mug of tea after the paper, but I've just realized I can't do that because the link is on my iPad that I'm reading off, but I will sort of send it to Charlie in case he wants to put it round. Now, as Jonathan Conlin has recently argued, there was a huge amount of variety within the sector and no 2 gardens were the same. Broadly speaking, there was a 3-part typology of establishments. So at the apex were the 4 formal gardens of Cooper's, Marylebone, Ranelagh and Vauxhall, indicated on the map by the little yellow dots. And here's an image of Marylebone Gardens from 1755. These were freestanding and contained landscape features such as trees, walks, groves and arbours, elaborate architectural additions in the form of pavilions, lodges, porticos, colonnades, and so on, spectacular entertainment such as balloon rides, firework displays, music and dancing, and in particular, extensive artificial lighting. Next were the 12 spas indicated on the map by the little fuchsia dots. I hope you can make that out. Here's an 1801 watercolor of a representative one. This is the so-called Peerless pool in Islington. These could also be quite elaborate, and like the formal gardens, usually charged an entrance fee. And finally, there were the tea gardens proper, by far the most ubiquitous type of establishment indicated on the map by the green dots. These were far simpler environments, didn't charge an entrance fee, and were nearly always located on a green space contiguous with an ale or adjacent to an inn, tavern, or ale house. So these were emphatically not freestanding establishments. However, even within the rubric of tea garden, visual evidence intimates that there was an enormous amount of variety in status and settings. Compare Copenhagen House in Islington, for example, a huge tavern with extensive grounds. You can just make out a little waiter there with his tea tray, with a much more bounded setting of the Yorkshire Stingo tavern and tea garden, tavern and tea room in Lisson Grove, and you can see its little little tea garden there on the left. Now, the social composition of pleasure garden patrons also varied enormously from place to place. The formal gardens of Cooper's, Marylebone, Ranelagh and Vauxhall were especially popular with a bon ton of Georgian London, as immortalised recently in Netflix smash hit Bridgerton. And here's a scene from the series set in Vauxhall Gardens. And their social exclusivity has recently been reaffirmed by Hannah Gregg's work on the Regency Beau Monde. However, most tea gardens appeared to a broader middle class of doctors, lawyers, clerks, students, shopkeepers, merchants, tradesmen, craftsmen, and their families. And they seem to have become even more socially inclusive into the 19th century as a working class mass market for popular entertainments emerged for the first time, with many even acquiring a reputation as unsavory haunts for the lower orders. In 1853, for example, the German tourist Max Schlesinger commented on London's vast number of pot houses, tea gardens, and places of a worse description where every vice finds a ready welcome. However, so far, information on the social makeup of tea garden goers is fairly patchy and anecdotal, and I'm currently working systematically through references to tea gardens in the Old Bailey online in an attempt to place their social profile on a firmer empirical footing, and that will form a key evidential basis for the article, but not quite ready for the paper, unfortunately. But returning to the sort of core theme of the seminar, consistent across all three types of alfresco space was the centrality of food and drink to the offering. Comestibles were by far the most important and profitable commodity on sale within the gardens. Vauxhall boasted a series of supper boxes, which you can just sort of make out to the rear there, containing tables and chairs where individual companies could eat, drink, and enjoy the view. Each box had its own little canopy and was decorated with a large painting, while numbered waiters were attached to particular boxes. And so well choreographed was Vauxhall's food and beverage operation that it was claimed in 1750 that up to 5,000 customers could be served at the same time. However, as their name denotes, these environments were most closely associated with a new generation of intoxicants, especially hot caffeinated beverages, and particularly tea. The cost of an admission ticket to the four formal gardens included the elegant regale of tea, coffee, and bread and butter, which could be redeemed upon submission with a metal token. And in 1789, for example, the botanist Mary Frampton noted that at Ranelagh Gardens, there were boxes around for tea, and as long as the fashion lasted, everyone delighted in it. Likewise, in 1791, the German traveller Friedrich August Wenderborn observed that Ranelagh was like Vauxhall, but more decency is likewise observable, for only tea and coffee are served. These beverages were also central to the experience of the 12 spas. An 1813 sale catalogue from Bagnigge Wells, for example, lists tea services or Worcester china, the tea boxes, 200 drinking tables and 400 tea boards amongst its movable goods. And at Highbury Barn Tea Garden in Islington in 1767, the owner advertised tea and hot loaves ready at a moment's notice, and new milk from the cows grazing in the pleasant meadows adjoining. And the tea arbor, or trellis, perhaps covered with honeysuckle and sweetbriar, is the classic motif of the tea garden within 18th and 19th century visual discourses. And here's an arbor depicted at the popular Spaniards Tavern in Hampstead. So I'm just keeping an eye on the time. Significantly, however, virtually all gardens offered old intoxicants as well, in the form of ale, beer, wine, and spirits. This is especially true of tea gardens, which, as we have seen, were nearly all located next to and operated by a traditional retailer, such as a tavern, inn, or alehouse. And here's another example. This is the Chalk Farm Tavern. Here's the pub, and here's the, you can just sort of make out the adjacent tea gardens to the left. Similarly, in 1762, the Chelsea tavern keeper, Thomas Bowen, deposed how I keep a tavern and sell coffee, the 1 ton. Going to Chelsea. On Sunday, the 19th of September, about 2 o'clock, the prisoner came into my garden, and after he had had some tea, he called for a pipe and walked about the garden. The last time I had served him with water to put in the teapot, I saw my 2 spoons lying then on the board by him. There was nobody in the garden at the time but him. My servant came in and said the 2 silver spoons were gone. I went out and found he was gone also and had not paid for his tea. A week and a day after this, my servant told me the man was coming then from towards Buckingham Gate. He said he had left 8p on the board for his tea when he went away. So here we have sort of tea being served in a tavern garden. However, I'm currently working, as I've said, I'm currently working systematically through tea garden references in the Old Bailey online, and preliminary results suggest that patrons were just as likely to be consuming alcohols in tea gardens, as well as tea or coffee. And this imbrication of old and new is also suggested by the visual record in this advertisement from 1796, for example. The Royal Cumberland Tea Garden in Vauxhall is marketed with a barrel and the god of Dionysius or Bacchus, the traditional iconography of wine and the retailing of wine. Likewise, in this satirical image from 1804, 3 male customers at Bagnigge Wells are depicted smoking and enjoying wine in an arbour, while the tea kettle languishes ignored and unattended in the background. And later in the 19th century, it was complaints and regulatory disputes around alcohol licenses that led to the enforced closure of many of the tea gardens. So characteristically for the project then, and this is something that we found across all of the varieties of space that we've been looking at, tea gardens were very much hybrid or hybridized consumption spaces in which old and new intoxicants overlapped and cross-fertilized. And I'd like to tentatively suggest 3 further ways in which tea gardens might have been especially conducive to the enjoyment of new intoxicants and facilitated their ongoing assimilation into metropolitan habits and diets. Firstly, as Miles Ogborn and others have pointed out, gardens were highly visual environments, dedicated to spectacle, the gaze, and the refined and distanced pleasures of the eye. Tree-lined vistas and paintings in the larger gardens, and in all gardens, green space and majestic contrasting views of country and city. And perhaps more so than any other kind of space then, this made them ideal viewing platforms for the conspicuous consumption of fashionable new commodities like coffee, sugar, tea and tobacco, and the performance of polite rituals surrounding them. The al fresco arbor, in which the refined tea table practices of families and friends were staged for other garden goers, was in this sense a physical equivalent of the conversation piece, the popular genre of 18th century portraiture, in which the tea-based sociability of fashionable metropolitan families was more literally framed for audiences. And I think this problematizes the persistent historiographical association of the tea table and its pleasures with privacy and domesticity. So as Rebecca Spang has famously commented of the restaurant, they were public places in which to be private, the quintessential space in which to see and be seen. And I think this also applies to tobacco consumption, which could be very publicly smoked or snuffed while strolling and promenading. And in this George Cruikshank etching of Marylebone Gardens from 1842, the central figure, you see the cursor there just here, is ostentatiously plucking snuff from his snuff box. While at Bagnigge Wells Spa, there were special seats on the banks of the River Fleet for those that, quote, choose to smoke. So very public environments for the enjoyment of new mind-altering commodities. Secondly, the offering of new intoxicants at spa gardens in particular, I think would have strengthened existing conceptual associations between coffee, tea, tobacco, and salubrity and good health. The 13 spa gardens were all located on the site of ancient chalybeate springs or wells, the mineral waters of which were believed to have healing properties when consumed. The availability of these curative drafts was central to the attraction and marketing campaigns around the spas, as in this colourful 18th century advert from St Pancras Wells, a popular spa garden. It was actually on the site of the present day St Pancras station, so rather more picturesque, certainly more bucolic than it is now. It actually includes sketches of the kidney stones that were voided by its customers after drinking the healing waters. And of course, St Pancras Wells also offered the best of tea, coffee, neat wines, curious punch, beers, other fine ales and cider, while in 1783, the diarist Samuel Curwen reported enjoying tea at Bagnigge Wells. Indeed, coffee and tea was often boiled with these very same medicinal waters. And as Amanda Herbert has recently observed, in the 18th century, there was a particular affiliation between spas and coffee making in particular. And again, this association also applies to smoking. At Sadler's Wells in Islington, spa goers were encouraged to take a reviving pipe of tobacco after taking the waters. So thirdly, and finally, I mean, it looks like I am going to come in quite considerably under time here, Charlie. So we'll have sort of lots of time for discussion. While not wishing to state the obvious, the gardens were resolutely botanical environments. Their lawns, shrubberies and trees offered a carefully curated, glamorized, sometimes exotic rusticity within the rapidly expanding metropolis, while those in outlying settings to points north, east, west and south offered dramatic vantage points from which the sprawl of the global imperial city could be gazed upon and consumed. And here's the view of London, including St Paul's Cathedral from Islington Spa in 1665. And they were therefore ideal, almost archetypal environments, I think, for the consumption of far-flung staples with tropical origins like fine imperial tea, coffee, sugar, and tobacco. And as the Macaroni Jester, which was a satirical pamphlet from 1772, put it, their tea garden's common drink was composed of a plant which grew in China, drawn with hot water, and mixed with the juice of the West India sugarcane, made it into a hard consistence, and that liquor was called tea. So to paraphrase, what more appropriate environment could there be for the enjoyment of colonial and intoxicating plant infusions? And on that note, I think I'll leave it there. Thank you. And here's another tea garden. This is the Queen's Head and Artichoke, which was a pub with an adjacent tea garden.